You know, some cars can get a little bit lost in translation, misinterpreted, and it's a crying shame because the net result is that they're horrifically underrated. And the Honda NSX perfectly embodies this. Sure, it's not as exotic as a Ferrari or as flamboyant as a Lamborghini, but it's a brilliant machine. And on our questionably crumbly tarmac out here on the UK, and when you've got weather as changeable as ours, I think it's got the measure of an F8 Tributo. This is the new and updated version of the NSX. I'm going to use it to show you why. Well, I don't think anybody can argue against the NSX looking the part because it's part manga cartoon with some of its really exaggerated features and part robot in disguise with an intensity that just stares right back at you. Like a beautifully folded piece of origami, there's neat and calculated creases that detail this overall shape. It's bold enough to capture the imagination, but Japanese enough to be polite about it. Ducts and vents channel the air around this car, with some surfaces cutting cleanly through the atmosphere and the others using it to generate downforce. It's a low-slung, raked profile with great big vents on its shoulders that all leads to this surprisingly pointed rear end. A neat diffuser plays host to a quartet of exhaust pipes bunched at the bottom. This specific car is finished in thermal orange, which is basically radioactive to your retinas, but I think it looks utterly fantastic with its contrasting carbon fibre trinkets. It's got 19-inch alloy wheels at the front and 20s at the back, hiding carbon discs. Something that just hints at the performance that lurks beneath this sculpture. I'd actually call this specification the Iron Brew Special because you've got this vivid orange paintwork and contrasting blue leather on the inside, which I know is not going to be to everyone's taste, but neither is Iron Brew. The sport seats are wide and accommodating, and whilst they're plenty bolstered, you don't feel hemmed in like you are in some other supercars, meaning that this is much more comfortable over a grand tour. The dashboard is full of interesting contours and brushed aluminium, and a big wide central stack divides you and your passenger. You sit low, you feel plugged in. But unlike other supercars, nothing in this cabin feels brittle or like it's going to fall off in your hands. This is a Honda after all, and it's been built to last. However, the cabin is starting to feel a bit dated now, and some of this switchgear has maybe had its time. However, the Achilles heel of this entire package is the infotainment system that just drives me mad. It was terrible in a Honda Civic, it is terrible in this. It's exactly the same system. It is clunky, it is slow, it is not intuitive. Things are hidden within menus, and frankly, its only saving grace, you can plug an iPhone or an Android device into it and use Apple CarPlay or Android Auto, which is basically what I've done from the second I got into it. And whilst we're chatting a slightly more negative tone, the boot in this car does leave much to be desired. Unlike an R8, you can't open the frunk. Instead, you've got a compartment behind the engine and sort of sat on top of the gearbox, meaning things get quite hot in there, so no frozen pizzas. But it's also 125 litres, which, you know, isn't all that much when you compare it to something more practical like a Porsche 911. But that's enough of the dull, boring bits of the NSX. I think it's about time we hit that starter button and went and chased some tarmac. Now, when you actually sit down and think about Honda as a whole, they're a pretty innovative bunch because they don't just make cars as broad as their selection of cars is. No, they make everything from lawnmowers to marine engines. Hell, they even make private jets and dirt buggies. So maybe it's unsurprising that when the NSX first launched, it was a little bit ahead of its time. You see, hybrid supercars weren't flavour of the month. Okay, they were technological innovators at the very echelons of motoring. But for more, I suppose, mainstream supercars, if that's even a phrase, it was questionable why you wanted a battery on board at all. Well, this platform informs the world exactly why Honda made the decisions it did. Because as well as a 3.5 litre twin turbocharged V6 over my shoulder, at the front there's two electric motors and there's another one back there as well. And the net result is all-wheel drive, 573 brake horsepower and 645 newton meters of torque. Those numbers are really, really impressive. However, it's how it applies them to the real world that really takes your breath away. Because the thing with an engine is it has to build. It builds to this big crescendo of power and torque, and you have to wait for it, especially if it's turbocharged. But with an electric motor, it's an on-off switch, as we know from other electric performance cars. Now, combining those two technologies, the old and new world, if you will, you get something that is utterly, utterly sublime. The electric motors kick in immediately, in fact, far faster than the engine even reacts. And the onboard computer will then feed the engine in, meaning you get utterly seamless, utterly responsive outputs from the car. And it's unlike almost any other vehicle. The responses from the powertrain are simply telepathic. They are that responsive, and that is exactly what you want in a high performance car. However, the NSX has its moods dictated by this big dial down here. Turn it one click to the left and you'll have the mode that I crept out of the garage in this morning. Quiet mode will use the electric motors at low speed, and it'll allow you to leave the garage without barking that V6 at the neighbours. But it also has a really great trait of whenever you're around town of predominantly using electricity like it is now. This car doesn't have a dedicated electric range or even a socket to charge it up. It's not a plug-in hybrid, but the system is sophisticated enough and the battery is good enough to get you at relatively low speeds through the urban sprawl without firing the engine at all. And it's not like it's a limp home mode either. Like, it's responsive, it knows what it's doing. And yeah, it's quite nice. It's weird with a car with so much visual theatre to quietly make its way through its adoring crowds, because, I mean, obviously this car gets a lot of attention and everyone's expecting the boom and noise of a supercar, but instead, like a spectre at a feast, you glide on by. Turn things up a notch, you enter sport mode, and this is kind of where the NSX spends most of its life. The combination of electric and petrol power is really seamless, how it slips in and out. Torque fills where the engine's building, you know, allows the engine to do its thing, just supplemented by the electric motors. It's great. The fact that this is all-wheel drive, and an intelligent all-wheel drive system at that, where it's distributing power as and when, and the torque vectoring is really at play continuously in this car to ensure that there's a beautiful level of grip and chassis balance. Yeah, it's super, super impressive. And I think in this mode, where you're maybe not driving it super hard, you can appreciate the other things that the NSX is really good at, like being a brilliant car to live with day to day. Okay, boot aside, this car has excellent visibility all the way around. There's not been one time where I've hesitated about where a car is in my blind spot. The mirrors stick out nice and wide. It's a great view actually, looking over those sort of haunches at the rear. But more importantly, I can see around the car. Big windows, pretty good rear visibility. Yeah, and it takes the edge off. It takes that air of intimidation off of driving a supercar on the regular. Pick up the pace and hit the twisties and you'll find this steering to be an utter joy, which is amazing because both the steering and the braking systems in this car are all fly-by-wire, meaning they're not physically connected to what they're controlling, which you would imagine would leave the whole thing feeling devoid and dead of any sort of interaction. And actually it's quite the opposite. Honda have really worked some magic here. I'm really quite impressed. The steering has a real deftness about it. You need very small inputs to manipulate the car in its change of direction. And whilst the bite of those carbon discs are obviously impressive, how you can really accurately modulate the brake pedal is more impressive again, because ultimately that is how you're interacting with the car. Turn things up and over again into Sport Plus and the car knows that you're ready to play. Everything weights up, everything tightens up. You can hear that engine being a bit more vocal. The Dct Gearbox, which is fantastic by the way, very, very subtle when left to its own devices, but incredibly responsive when you crank the whip, has already selected a lower gear. It knows we're ready to play. You very quickly get a feel that the NSX has a total read on the road ahead of it. It doesn't pound against the tarmac, it doesn't struggle against cambers. it just flows and ebbs with the tarmac. It's really beautiful. There are situations where you're very aware that the Honda NSX is a wide car, but it does a great job of shrink wrapping around you when you're really on it. The car just feels fantastic on the road. There's an abundance of grip, but then that said, this isn't a PlayStation game. It doesn't feel like it's an overly digital experience because I'm getting so much communication through the chassis, and it's not afraid to slip and grip as well. You do get some lateral motion through the bends. Some people will actually be really surprised what an intuitive and involving experience the NSX is as a modern day hybrid supercar. Tip it into a corner, there's lovely balance, you can tailor it on the throttle, little wiggle from the hips on the way out, lovely. Cool, calm, collected, predictable. That's what this car does. It's not that it doesn't have a sense of fun, it's not that it doesn't want to have fun, but you're plugged into it to the point where you're always on top of it. Now, as mentioned before, this is the updated NSX, and yeah, there's not an abundance of changes between this car and the car that came before it. There's no increase in power, there's no new torque mapping, there's nothing like that. In fact, the changes are relatively limited. However, the changes they have made have been very calculated. So you'll find that the suspension up front is 26% stiffer, it's 19% stiffer at the rear. There are new tweaks to the suspension, it's been tightened up, the steering has been made a little bit faster, and there's new Continental Contact 6 tyres gripping the road beneath me. Now, all of these changes on the surface seem quite subtle and maybe not something people jumping from one car to the other may notice. That is until you dial it all the way up into track mode. Now, fair warning, this does turn off some of the electronic nannies, so don't do this without parental supervision, kids. But you can feel how the car resists body roll a little more. You can feel the added agility of the car. And whilst these Contact 6 tyres maybe wouldn't have been my personal preference, they do a pretty good job on a mild day. I have to say, the roads out here, it rained earlier and it started to dry up and we're sort of left with this slightly greasy film. And the car is doing a really good job of just digging in and finding traction. And yeah, if you barrel into a corner all too quickly, you do come across some understeer. I mean, that's easily trimmed off with the throttle. You can feel the chassis at play beneath you, and it's an absolutely incredible thing at just deploying that performance in a controlled, concise, and ferocious manner whenever you really do let it go. And that's the big thing with this car. In other hairy-chested sort of supercars, you will be fighting it in conditions like this to drive quickly. Whereas the NSX always has this level of composure, like it knows what the road ahead holds. It's not that it's dull and detached and doing all the work for you, because it lets you have a play. But there is just a sense of total dominion over the performance that you are exploiting here. But something else that track mode enables is launch control, and that's something that will get you from 0 to 62 miles per hour in 3 seconds and begins that journey to a top speed of 191 miles per hour. Slow, this car is not. It is a crying shame that the NSX is overlooked by some supercar buyers that seemingly just chase badge kudos. And I think much like this car's predecessor, it's going to be really relished in 10-15 years' time. It's just being a more down-to-earth and incredibly capable machine. Maybe that's it. People should forget about their Ferraris and McLarens and Lamborghinis for a moment. Don't adopt a puppy. Don't sponsor a polar bear. Buy a Honda NSX. You know, the Honda NSX isn't necessarily going to win you a game of top trumps. But do you know who plays top trumps? Children, and not people who drive cars like this. The Honda NSX was misunderstood when it was new because people sort of forgot what NSX stood for. New Sports Car Experimental. And when this was box fresh, when this was brand new and you wanted a hybrid supercar, you were spending £1 million on a P1 or a Porsche 918 or LaFerrari. This brought the technology to this playing field long before anybody else. And people shouldn't forget that. This car pushed boundaries. This thing did the thing that Honda do best: surprise you. Head to YesAuto.com for the latest car news and reviews, and don't forget to check us out on social media. We're in all the usual places such as Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. Simply search for YesAuto.